Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Zsuzanna Pato. Zsuzanna is a senior senior director at RAP. RAP is one of the major think tanks in terms of the regulatory assistance program, and Zsuzanna has a long history in regulation policy and advising from RAP itself, which is an NGO and supports with some clear thinking into the regulatory environment in Europe. Zsuzanna is going to be speaking at the forthcoming Powergrid Leaders event in March the 12th, 13th in Amsterdam, looking at the deployment of grids across Europe. So welcome, Zsuzanna. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk.
Yeah. Grids is obviously a key area, a key challenging area now, as we're starting to see that obviously the ramp up of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. We're seeing the increasing usage of heat pumps, of electric vehicles, and everyone is clear that the electron is going to take a much more significant share of the energy markets as we look to decarbonize over the next 2 decades. But clearly, grids are challenging to build, challenging to regulate, challenging to create the right environment. There's a lot of, I guess, resistance and NIMBYism. They obviously are quite large physical infrastructures. So what are some of your thoughts as we record this in September 2024 around the key challenges that you're seeing in Europe and equally globally? I know you have a global remit there at RAP. So yeah, over to you, Zsuzanna. What are some of your initial thoughts?
Well, first, maybe just a few sentences about how I ended up in this sphere. So I work for RAP. I joined RAP 7 years ago. RAP, Regulatory Assistance Project, is an independent nonprofit organization working around the globe. And we are a mission-led organization. So we would like to provide policy innovation and thought leadership on how to make the energy transition happen quickly and as cost-efficient as possible. So with regards to grids, I mean, now I think there is a general recognition, even at the political debate, that grids has become a major bottleneck in the whole energy transition. This is not a European issue. The same issue is in the US, in Brazil, and also in India and China. So we have to do something with grids because the demand for grids, the gap between the demand for grids and the supply of grid services is getting wider and wider. And I think it's useful to think about the need for grids in 2 ways. One is actually we need to build new grids, both at the transmission and the distribution level. No one actually disputes that. But before that, we have to have a very close examination how we use the existing assets we have and make a much better use, because these options are usually much quicker to implement and they are usually much cheaper. So the main challenge I see for the regulator, as grids are regulated assets, national monopolies, is to close this gap. And there are various options, like a huge grid toolkit you can come up with. And some of the options are quick fixes. You can implement probably like in a few months to change some of the network codes and some of these minor regulatory instruments, and some of them mid or long-term innovations. Whenever a regulator in a state recognizes that there is a need to change the grid regulation, it has to go through all the options and come up with a mix of options that is suitable to the problems they are having. I think I would probably highlight 3 topics or 3 challenges the regulator, probably most of them, would need to tackle. One is the low level of transparency we have on grids. The grid companies, they have this knowledge, but the existing and potential new users of grid, they don't. So this is a no-brainer. Everyone should know where available capacities are, because the whole process of connecting new consumers to the grid would be much more efficient. So transparency is one, and the European Commission and the European countries now, I think, try to improve the situation there. The second is planning.
Just interrupt. Is that challenge? I mean, is it around the sort of, I guess, loss of power, or is there a natural conservatism around the operators of grids? in terms of the capacity factors and wanting to make sure that the grid is always working. What are some of the human reasons around that lack of transparency, and are there some sort of specific solutions that can actually help regulators force people to be more transparent?
Well, I don't think it's the regulators. It's not the regulators who are not transparent. That's the grid companies. And the reason is, I think it's just historical. In the past, there were just a few connections, maybe 10, 20, or 50 per year. And they were either large power plants or large industrial users, so not many. The whole energy transition upset the whole grid structure. So we have 80% of new generation in Europe is going to be at the distribution level. So distribution system operators are not used to have this kind of huge connection requests flooding in, because they hardly ever dealt with such a huge amount of new requests. So simply, there was not such a big value of being transparent in the past, but now this is becoming a very critical asset for all the new users. Let it be new industrial load. I mean, many industries try to transit away from fossil gas and electrify. So sometimes not new factories, but existing factories who want to connect. And of course, lots of renewables and storage. And at the low voltage, well, most of households were very similar, with very similar load profiles. Now we will have a range of very different households, some with 1 EV, some with 2, some with PV, some with power Tesla walls. So the heterogeneity of the consumers will go up exponentially in any country.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Sorry, I interrupted around the
It's okay.
made.
So, so that's all about transparency. With regards to planning, of course, in Europe, we have planning practices. So at the transmission level, we have a European-wide planning. At the distribution level now, each distribution system operator has to plan and submit it to the regulator every second year. That's the European law.
Right.
But as I said, in the past, the new connection request and the need to expand the network was much more gradual. And now it's going to be exponentially high. So we also have to rethink our planning practices, especially the linkage between transmission and distribution. So there is this dual governance, but in fact, the grids are just grids.
Yeah.
And increasingly interconnected. So whatever happens at the distribution level has an impact at the transmission level and vice versa. And also we have to rethink our planning and not only respond to existing requests, but we have to think forward, much more forward than we used to be. So this is the concept of anticipatory planning. And this is a concept much debated in Europe. So I think even next year, it's going to be one of the key issues with regards to grids. And probably the third one is also between the information asymmetry between the regulator and the network companies. Of course, we all know this from the academic literature, but it's really true. So with increasing technological build-out options, we have for each network company has much bigger range of options than before. This asymmetry gets bigger and bigger between the two players. So I cannot imagine a regulator being able to judge on whatever is proposed by the distribution company. So the better way to approach is to incentivize on the outputs. So the regulator should define, coming from the social goals, like what we want from the network, what kind of services, what level, what security, what resiliency, how quick, what speed, and from then on, try to incentivize financially these companies. And they would know best how to meet these output requirements. So I think incentives are key in bringing these network companies on board.
Yeah. And how would those incentives be structured? What sort of incentive environment do you foresee, and how will it evolve from how they currently are incentivized?
Well, there are some major flaws in the incentive regimes in most countries. First of all, often there are biased incentives to do more capital investment instead of OPEX heavy solutions. And as I said, we do need capital investment. So that's the question. But we have to figure out what is the optimal mix between wire and non-wire solutions. And most of the existing regulation in the member state doesn't have that. So one option is actually to move to a topex regulation. Some countries experiment already with it. So that would get away with
that term topex regulation refers to
total.
So yeah, combining capex.
So you don't make a difference between a capex and topex in terms of what the network company would rather invest in. So you make indifference to the type of costs, and that helps the network company to come up with an optimal share between the two, I would say. The least cost, mix of these solutions. And the other one is, which is quite a new thing in the regulatory sphere, and there are some experiments in Europe and outside Europe, is to come up with these performance objectives at the output. And then link financial incentives, could be rewards and penalties, or rewards only or penalty only, and then leave it to the network company, how he actually would deliver these services. And well, there is some experiment in the US. I think the most important case is in Hawaii, where they transformed their own incentive system for the network. And also the UK has a topex approach for several years. And Italy spent quite a lot of effort in the last 8-10 years to change their incentive regime to a more output-based. But most of the countries, they haven't done much on this, I have to say.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I think you've outlined some of the key challenges that we're facing as we enter, I guess, the next decade and look to really ramp up grid deployments. But I guess, as you say, focused on the outputs, the actual grid capacity and decarbonization, and being able to deal with what is obviously a fast, ever more complex situation with a whole variety of different technical solutions, but also increasing demand curves, and certainly demand curves that could outpace anything that we've seen in the past. So yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Zsuzsanna. Many thanks for sharing your thoughts. You gave a very good overview of some of the issues that are going to be discussed, as I mentioned, at the forthcoming event on the 12th to 13th of March, the Powergrid Leaders event in the Netherlands. So many thanks, Zsuzsanna. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you at the event come March 2025.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to see you all there.
Excellent. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.